Thank you to the two Matts from John Deere and Case IH. So we're now going to move back onto our farmer presentations, and first up in this second session is Michael Pfitzner. Michael and Larissa have a broadacre cropping enterprise 35 k's north of Griffith. He's been collecting yield data for 20 years and since converting to controlled traffic farming has been able to quantify production gains on their farms with evidence-based agriculture. Michael's been involved with SPAR for a number of years. He's given a number of presentations. We've got a PA in practice publication, and Michael was even a case study way back in 2012 in a GRDC project. So lots of activity Michael does with SPAR and a lot of farming groups. So let's welcome Michael to discuss PA.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here to have a bit of a chat about I guess our journey with precision agriculture, which is over quite a lengthy time now. Okay, so today I'm just going to give a little bit of a background of where we've been, where we've come from, controlled traffic farming, I guess why we do it, and just can you have a show of hands? Anyone here doing controlled traffic? There's a couple of hands. I had no intention of doing controlled traffic farming, but as I'll explain, there was a few light globe moments that had us down that track, and it's opened up a lot of doors. There was a bit of talk before about nitrogen strips, and also sandy soils and what we do with those, and variable rate technology and what we do. So a bit of background: we farm 2,800 hectares, 35 k's north of Griffith. Soil is red sandy loam. It's sort of around that. It's probably a bit closer to 5.1 than 5.2, and areas getting a little bit more acid than that. Phosphorus is not too bad, 35, 55 Col-P. Nitrogen, we've managed to retain levels up to 40 to up to 100 kilos, probably a little bit lower this year. Zinc and copper, always low in soil test, but we've never seen a response. Farms mostly flat to slightly undulating with some dune swale type areas, sandy soils. We've been 20 years yield mapping, 12 years variable rate, and 10 years in controlled traffic farming. So we've got a fair bit of data behind what we do. Rainfall last year 295 mils, growing season 163 mils. As you know, it was a pretty bit of a lean year. Average rainfall is roughly, I suppose, 410 to 430 mils, in growing season 257 as an average. So that's where our farm sits. I've got a graph here that's looking at rainfall, and it's a cumulative rainfall graph. So in other words, if the rainfall for a given year goes up by 200 mils, the graph goes up, and if the rainfall is below average by 200 mils, the graph goes down. And we start to see a bit of a trend, and I think this is important in understanding where we sort of take our variable rate, whether we're in a moisture declining period as we were in the noughties, the 2000s to 2009, or we're sort of building moisture in these latter years. Obviously there was a bit of a dip last year, and I guess it's interesting to note the trend is still up, but because it's down, generally the trend is usually down with a couple, not just one. Well, there's one, but generally the downtrend tends to be a couple or hold. So my gut feel is that this year's probably not going to be above average, just based on that. Interesting, if you do the same with growing season, we're still in decline. There's only, over the last 15 years, there's only been a few above average growing seasons. So I guess what that's telling me is that our rainfall patterns are more summer based, and if we don't have stored moisture this year, then it's probably a big ask relying on growing season rainfall to get us over the line, is my gut feel. So I've got here, compaction is free, but at what cost? Sheep, interestingly, they love controlled traffic. They make sheep tracks everywhere. They obviously cottoned onto this idea well before we even thought of it, but it's an interesting slide nonetheless. So what got us into controlled traffic farming? Back in 2008, we got some satellite imagery done, and it was high resolution satellite imagery. It was 60 centimetre pixel size. Showed pretty much every wheel track that not only was going east-west, we were sowing east-west in those periods, but also we sowed field peas in here north-south. And with the software, we could work out that we were actually running a wheel over 48% of the paddock, and that really sent alarm bells to me, because this was new information that I hadn't realised, and you could sort of see the result of reduced biomass. At the time, when I was thinking about getting into controlled traffic farming, there was a few of the machinery guys saying, look, you're wasting your time, why even bothering? This is valid in Queensland on those cracking clay soils, you're on red sandy loam, what are you going to achieve? So I thought, well, rightio, we better put some numbers behind this. So in 2009, we had a bit of a trial where, well, not really a trial, I just next to a fence line counted in 40 runs of this trial paddock and snapped off the heads for a half metre row, weighed the heads to roughly work out yield per row. Obviously, looking at where wheel tracks we're next to the fence here, and then you could assume that pretty much from here, from here through, wasn't going to get a wheel on it, because you can't physically get a machine close enough to the fence to get a wheel there. And then here is probably fairly representative of the rest of the paddock. So you can see as we're close to the fence here, yield variation 2.4, there's one up to 4, looking at each individual row. So from 1 to 24, the average was 2.3 tonnes to hectare, excluding the wheels. So in this area here, that's what it was averaging, 2.3 tonnes a hectare, which gave us a gross margin of $132 a hectare. That's profitable. In the wheel tracks, was just looking at these four rows, 1.77 tonnes a hectare. That's still profitable, $47 a hectare. But from 27 to 41, which is, I guess, representative of the rest of the paddock, having random traffic, 1.35 tonnes to the hectare in this given year. It was a leaner year. That was actually a minus $20 a hectare gross margin, or a loss of $152 a hectare compared to this part. So I guess answering the question of is it profitable in this particular paddock, that was about $20,000 of lost profit. And if we then made that assumption over the whole farm, there's probably $420,000 of lost profit on the whole farm, just looking at that base exercise. Admittedly, there's a few assumptions there, but there's enough numbers there to tell me that we're heading in the right direction. So benefits of controlled traffic farming: can sow on marginal moisture, because the cropping zone remains friable, the wheel tracks remain hard. When spraying, there's very little dust tie-up in the wheel tracks. There's better water infiltration, although when there's too much water it can be a bit of an issue, as in 2016. But surprisingly, we could actually spray through quite a bit of water in that year because the tracks were firm. The trafficability of the paddocks was quite amazing. I've never experienced anything like it. Other benefits of permanent wheel tracks: if your paddock layout is right, it can actually help drain paddocks. Also, the cracking in the wheel tracks is actually a pretty good vehicle, I suppose, for getting moisture back into the paddocks when it does become wet. The tracks remain hard, they crack out and enable moisture to get in fast. Wheels promote weeds. This is just a couple of pictures there of when I was spraying. This is in a canola stubble. You can see where the chaser bin turned around there, and there's it's promoted weeds. Disadvantage of permanent wheel tracks: there can be a bit more runoff on slopey ground. because the tracks are hard and moisture, or the rain runoff is faster on those tracks and can create a bit more erosion. Bit more evidence of wheel tracks. We've changed a lot of our orientation from east-west to north-south, and you can see still, I think that was about 8 years after we've changed, there's still some inherent tracking there. So yeah, we're on a 12-metre system. It's what they call a 3-to-1, so 3 seeder and harvester widths compared to 1 sprayer width, and our spreader is 24 metres, so it all fits in with the system. Nitrogen strips, we mucked around with higher just spreading by hand, higher nitrogen rates, working out what upper levels and lower levels were on these sand rises. I guess when it gets to a stage like this where you get a large visual response, it's nearly too late to do something about it, or the horse has already bolted. So yeah, nitrogen, you can't manage what you don't measure, and that's a fantastic benefit of controlled traffic. Everything's matched up, so here's a nitrogen strip that we put out, and a bit of satellite imagery showing the difference in biomass. And one thing that we try to do is put a couple nil strips as well as extra strips in. This actually shows up a spray miss in here. So there's lots of things you can learn with satellite imagery, and then combining that with yield maps. So you can see here, this was just a trial strip of nitrogen that we put in this paddock with a couple of nil strips and different strips, and then the yield map corresponding that. And again, you can work out quantitatively what this strip here so that was 100 kilos of urea applied top dress, and that increased the yield from up to 2.8 tonnes to the hectare. Well, that was what the average was, 2.8 to 3.6 tonnes to the hectare. So you can see what sort of economic response that we've had from doing that. Also, the nil strip in there yielded 2.3 tonnes to the hectare. So if you're just comparing nil to what the average was, it's not too bad, but lifted it 2.3 to 3.6, that's pretty massive. So the way that we've gone about it is with a urea boom towing our air cart. The benefit of that is the accuracy, I guess, in windy conditions, and also if we're spreading canola, we can use multiple products. The limitation, I guess, is the more volume you put through, the slower you're going to have to go. But it's highly accurate, as you can see there, where it's been and where it hasn't. We still see urea as the cheapest form of nitrogen. The air cart provides another use, and variable rate multiple products is a pretty big benefit. But we start to wondering whether urea is the farmer's cocaine, and whether we're really addicted to this stuff, because we're really seeing what we can do. So this is sort of taking a step back of I guess how we got to where we are now. The foxhole effect. There was actually a foxhole here that we filled in with a loader and a bucket, and this is on a sandy rise. And you can see the difference in crop growth where this foxhole was compared to where it wasn't. We did, and even the root growth. And this is still an issue that we're looking at a broad scale as part of GRDC project too, with agroagronomy. Soil testing, only short distance apart, the only difference was pH, and what we suspect the foxholes, like they're actually bringing up alkaline soil to the surface, but it was probably more the mixing effect that's going on, not just pH. We did a manure lime trial that following year. So there was manure strip in here, and there was actually a lime strip in here, which didn't really show up as much as what this manure strip did. So this is a sandy rise in the paddock, and you can see this is our old sowing line going east-west, and the effect that's causing. But interestingly, the manure is actually masking a fair bit of that. So obviously the manure feeding the crop on this sandy rise, the root's been able to explore the soil and extract more moisture. This was a bit of a learning curve that we've finally come across with these sandy soils. And we set up a few more trials where we used manure on these sand rises. There's a nil treatment in there. There was a ripping treatment in there, and 2 years worth of manure in there. And in the various zones of this paddock, so we've got good biomass with manure. So we can sort of get a comparison. So the good biomass area with the manure was actually a minus return. The average, again, a minus return. It was only when we got to these very poor areas that we were getting a yield increase of 0.7, but more specifically a profit increase of $30 a hectare. When there was multiple, like 2 years of manure, 0.8 of a tonne to the hectare yield increase. So manure was doing a trick, but we wanted to explore a little bit more and perhaps a little bit cheaper, whether it was manure or whether we could just do it with nitrogen. So this is how one of the paddocks looks, and you can see the big sand rise sort of goes through this area here. 2008, 2011, 2012, fairly consistent. We're seeing this sand rise show up in all those yield maps. Initially, when we started with variable rate, we were thinking, well, why are we wasting our time on these areas? Perhaps we should back off our inputs. But we actually found the reverse to be the case. What we ended up doing was working out, well, there's not enough plants on these sand rises, they don't tiller, so we increased our seeding rates on the sand rise and basically doubled our nitrogen fertiliser on those sand rises, and I guess this is the result compared with 2000. We turn this sand hill around, you can see. So the green area there, the yield's 2 to 4 tonnes a hectare, which is quite an increase from here, where it was pretty much a tonne of the hectare, just by increasing seeding rates and nitrogen. 2015, so that was lupins, and as we all know, lupins love sandy soils, yielding probably 3 and 4 tonnes a hectare on the sand rise. And then 2016, which was quite wet, these areas got flooded out. So variable rate nitrogen actually worked pretty well, because we had low rates of nitrogen on these areas that ended up getting flooded out anyway, and we actually pumped these up so that on that yield map there, it's actually in the green is 4 to 5 tonnes a hectare off these sand rises, which is quite remarkable considering, I thought a good yield on those was 1.5 tonnes a hectare, whether it was a good year or a bad year. We're always finding moisture there after harvest, and the crop wasn't utilising it. So for these particular paddocks, they've actually responded really well. And that's actually a picture of that paddock, except it's looking at it the other angle, looking at north to south rather than south to north. So you can see this sand rise here and the areas of water. So yeah, it was, as we know, 2016 was quite a wet year. And this was the same paddock, canola this last year. Again, another paddock that has these sandy soils in them. You can see this big sand rise in through here. Yield map from 1999, and then 2017, last year's yield map. Quite extraordinary, given that last year was a lean rainfall year. This paddock averaged a bit better than 3 tonnes to the hectare, and these sand rise parts in here were between 3 and 5 tonnes to the hectare. So quite extraordinary in a dry year. And that's basically our seeding prescription map. So these green areas basically get up to about 60 kilos of seed, and then depending on how we feel about the season, if our base rate's 70 kilos of nitrogen on the rest of the paddock, then these patches get up to about 150 kilos of urea. Also interesting having a few different varieties in the paddock to get enabling us to actually get a pretty good measurement on yield variation between varieties, which is another handy tool. Cobra this last year really got smacked by frost and really didn't recover as well as Beckham, or even Lancer. Lancer actually outperformed both those by quite a bit. So the average of the paddock there, I think, was about 2.5 tonnes a hectare. The Cobra really got smacked. It was under about a tonne to the hectare. Over the period of time, we've used a few different sources of satellite imagery, which gives us some good information through the year. In this particular paddock here, there's a few things going on. It was a vetch stubble, and we used Secura in the wheat on this section here, which, as we know, Secura does reduce biomass early on. Two halves of this paddock. This half was vetch hay. This half was vetch seed. But this blue area here is actually a bit of self-sown vetch in amongst this. If we have a look at how the paddock has responded a bit later, you can see that Secura damage has sort of disappeared somewhat, and the vetch hay side is starting to actually get more biomass than the vetch seed side. So anyway, some take-home messages. Compaction was costing us a lot more than what we thought. Controlled traffic allowed us to quantify dollars per hectare with fertiliser responses, and we've actually come to understand our sandy soils a lot more, and they can be a lot more profitable than what we first thought with variable rate farming, just manipulating seeding rates and fertiliser, and also growing acid tolerant varieties. I know lime is something that we have looked at, but and certainly some of these sandy soils have got an issue that a 0 to 10 doesn't actually pick up that well. It's actually probably a 0 to 12 or a 0 to 14 centimetre depth. So variable rate lime is something that we're going to look at down the track, but short term, acid tolerant varieties and variable rate is helping us big time on these sandy soils. So thank you.